It was supposed to be a punishment, the servants would say later, when the story had acquired its shape and its rumors. They said it as if that one word could explain everything that followed. It was a punishment, a lesson struck out of a father's temper, an order given under the heat of insult and the clink of crystal. But what came after? The muddy roads, the cramped cabin, the quiet that stretched between two people who had never been meant to know each other, was more complicated than any single explanation. It would not be cleaned, sold, or excused by the soft whisper of a single sentence. It left stains. The ball at São Jerônimo was a small storm of light and perfume. Candles bowed under crystal chandeliers, throwing islands of gold across polished tables and the white shoulders of women in silk. Music moved through the hall like a warm current. Violins stitched time with a patient, sure hand. August carried the smell of summer into the room, sweat and lemon oil and the faint metallic tang of horses that stood tethered beyond the courtyard. Helena de Menezes arrived like the weather, full of attention, expected to change the atmosphere wherever she stood. At 22 she wore her beauty as others wore a fine shawl, both as armor and as ordnance. Her waist was narrow, her voice knew the tones of command and amusement. People who had not wished to be noticed found themselves noticed. She had ways of turning away men whose eagerness bored her, and she enjoyed the economy of those refusals. That evening a count, a man who believed his wealth could be translated into any concession, misread a smile for invitation. He came too close with a hand that had no respect for faces or the code of courtesies. He made a remark, a murmur that crossed too quickly into insolence, meant to flatter in public and to own in private. Helena's reply was a blade. She dismantled him with a phrase that left the room exposed, and laughter rose in little brittle waves. The Count flushed, his smartness stripped down to injury. Her father, Colonel Augusto de Menezes, watched from a group of men like a judge lit from all sides by men's respect and fear. The colonel's face was a map of actions. He was a man who measured the world in commands. The slap came not from a man stung for a word, but from an authority that could not abide exposure of the household's honor. In the hush that followed, his hand struck his daughter with a suddenness that felt like the breaking of a small instrument of porcelain. It was small as violence and enormous as a signal. The ball's music continued as if nothing had happened, but all the candlelight seemed to tilt. Women gathered their skirts around their knees as if against a chill. The colonel did not wait for embarrassment to be swallowed. He pronounced his sentence in front of guests. Helena would be removed from the household's ease and sent to live at the family's frontier outpost under the supervision of Batuk, the capataz who ran the post. "You will learn to live like those you look down on," he said, his voice a barge cutting through a crowd. "You will learn humility." The words landed like stones. To Helena, they were a kind of treason. To the colonel, they were a sacrament. There would be no discussion. The guests murmured. Some clapped as if approving the enforcement of order. The Count looked away. Batuk arrived at the house as a man with a reputation not of show, but of consequence. Once enslaved, he was now what the estate called a free overseer, eyes like dark river stones, arms like the bent trunks of citrus trees, and a face whose lines had been carved by weather and work. He did not smile easily. He had the air of someone whose life had been a series of reckonings. He took Helena's travel cloak with hands that were precise and unhurried. He watched her with a reserve that was not curiosity so much as a measure. He kept himself at the right distance because he had learned that most distances must be measured before they are crossed. The punishment flattened the household into necessary motions. Helena refused at first, refused in language, in posture, in economy of obedience. She had the right to refuse. She had always had the right. Yet there was no grace in a household where one man's fury outweighed a woman's dignity. She was placed upon a horse with her green silk torn at the hem, a badge of the change to come. The servants looked away or lowered their eyes. Some whispered that Colonel Menezes had been too proud to bear the laughter of men that night. Others said he struck out of fear that his daughter's defiance might start winds they could not command. The truth settled in the space between what was said and the way the colonel would not look his daughter in the face as the carriage rolled away. If it was punishment, it was administered with all the sharpness of authority. A door closed, a horse's hoofs on the road like an eraser. The ride to the frontier was a small unthreading of Helena's life. The road swallowed the carriage's lamps, and the air cooled. The town lights thinned into a smear, and then they were gone. The forest met the road as if to remind travellers of limits, branches like fingers, nocturnal sounds that had nothing to do with polished drawing rooms. Helena watched the world she knew recede. Each mile took off a trim, a ribbon, some small luxury, until finally the carriage slowed to the pace of the horses, then to a trot, then to a reluctant halt at a gate that creaked as if complaining at being opened. The frontier post was no more than a compound of a few buildings pressed close to the land, a barn where horses stamped and breathed, a storehouse, and a low cabin where smoke had been known to thicken like grief. Lamplight inside was small, crude glass and oil, throwing a pool of glow that was nothing like the chandeliers she had left. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and the kind of cooking that did not aim to charm, but to sustain. The bed was a mattress of straw. The table was a plank fixed on rough legs. The mirror was a sliver clouded with time. The silk dress lay on a chair like a dead bird. Batuque showed her the cabin without ceremony. He had a way of moving through that place, as if he had already known it would have to hold tempests. He placed a bundle of rough cloth at the foot of a bed and said, as if to an instruction given long ago and now simply arriving at its due moment, "The work is the rule. You will eat what you are given. You will sleep when the work allows. No one is here to press you but the land itself." Helena's first days were a litany of small wounds. Tasks that required neither strategy nor invention proved mountainous. To hold a metal pan without burning, to light tinder that would not refuse flame, to scrub a pot until it lost the last filmy sheen of domestic polish. She burned a palm trying to coax tinder. She bent over a pail and felt humiliation rise like bile. The hands she used to lift a fan now learned to haul a bucket. The green silk that caught light became an ecru smear of earth. Batuque kept silence the way some men kept bedrock. He did not scold when she failed. He corrected with small practical gestures. When Helena could not keep a steady flame, he reached across the hearth and adjusted the kindling without a lecture. When she could not steady the whip of a horse, he took the reins and did not look at her, as if she were a specimen. Words from him were few and exact. 2 fingers under, he would say when showing how to make a fire, not for show, when passing her a knife. His voice was low and close, the kind used in places where one could not afford theatricality. She resented him for being the agent of her exile, and resented herself for needing his hands. The days made their own rhythm, and in time Helena began to map new currencies of dignity. If the ball had been a market of glances and approvals, this place bought value with endurance. She learned to take weather into account, to wipe sweat from her brow before the sting of irritation could become a tirade. She learned that grief could be a steady friend. It taught one to do the small things with an economy of feeling. Once, in the first week, she sank to the ground and pressed her burning palms to a well-worn plank, then laughed, a short, incredulous sound that had no taste of grace. Batuque handed her a bowl of soup without comment. Later, he would whittle a small bead out of a scrap of wood and drop it into her palm, an act that had the economy of a prayer. Batuque's shadowed past unfolded in fragments, the way riverbeds reveal old stones when the water drops. He had been bought as a child, taught how to read with the crooked patience of a master who favored him, beaten with the economy of someone who measured punishment as tuition. He spoke of that life not with complaint, but with the clear, sometimes surprising relish of someone who had turned suffering into a ledger of necessary knowledge. He knew the patterns of the land and the habits of men. He had survived by not allowing himself to be wholly taken. He could offer both mercy and an implacable refusal to be used. When he did speak of himself, he did so sparingly. Helena learned the facts in pieces. A town at the coast, where once he had been sold, a master who taught him a little reading, a time when he had been given the responsibility of the post after his master's estate dissolved. He carried stories like small flint stones, useful, hardened, kept in the pocket. He had the look of a man who had once been small under other men's feet, and now wore the authority that came from having survived. The turning of the seasons in the cabin did not relent for compassion. The forest outside the front gate was a tutor harsher than any school. There were mornings when rain would come down, as if the sky were converting itself directly into pressure. The ground soaked and oozed. Horse hooves left deep mouths in the road. Once, bathing in a river that ran cold and clear, Helena let the water lift from her the last of the powdered perfumes. She felt for the first time that the skin beneath had a history that was not concession. Small kindnesses threaded the hours. Batuka cooked sometimes with the patience of a man who knew how hunger changed a person's measure. He offered her the center of the loaf on days when food was scant, not to perform magnanimity, but because the economy of fairness had his preference. Once he quietly corrected a knot she made in a rope, guiding her hands with the minimum of instruction. Another time he stood between her and a storm of wasps, swatting them away with a practiced wrist. Each act had a weight not of showiness, but of an attention that felt gradually like care. Helena found herself changing the way she spoke. The cadences sharpened. The anecdotes that once filled salons grew spare. When she did speak of the house in which she had been raised, her voice no longer held the lightness of disdain but a thinness of memory. She complained less often and listened more. She began to understand, in the way that comes only after a humiliation has become ordinary, that authority was not a single power, but a network of small demands. Being unmade at the level of custom was not a loss as much as an opportunity to see the scaffolding behind life's pageantry. At night, she lay awake with sounds of the frontier pressed to her ears, the low of cattle, the murmuring of men in the distance, the breathing of horses, and she would think of the colonel's face. Sometimes in the dark, the anger took ferocity and made her reach for revenge in thought. She imagined sending a letter that would make him shrink, or perhaps she would lay out the truth in front of his bylaws. Sometimes she simply felt small, which for a woman who had been taken seriously for 10,000 small reasons was its own punishment. But the most disquieting shifts were not in the work. They occurred in the narrow spaces where two lives brushed and left impressions. Batuk respected lines. He did not seek to cross them quickly. He understood the ethics of presence. When a person had been used by systems that treated them as objects, the first obligation was to be human in return. He called her not Sinhá with clipped irony, but Helena the first time he used her name without need. The sound of it was like a coin struck into the hush, a small private thing that belonged only to them. She caught at it, at first with the reflex of someone surprised by permission. He taught her to make coffee over an open flame, guiding her fingers through the clink and clatter, not because the task required his authority, but because it did not require theatre. The first cup he made she burned, and the second was bitter but real. The third she drank without pretension, and felt something like lightness. She began to laugh in ways she had not in public halls, sharp, sudden, sometimes at nothing. Once she told him a joke from the city, ill-suited to the frontier, and he laughed so plainly that she was stilled and delighted by the sound. The closeness that grew between them was not ordained by a romantic script. It was the gradual arrangement of trust and need. He shared a memory of a shore where he had been near to a child, and she in turn spoke of a bruise that had become more than skin deep because it revealed a new limit of pride. There was no attempt to rewrite the moral ledger of what had happened to her. She had been punished. He had been forced by duty to receive her. The injustice remained in the air like smoke, but inside that air something else grew, a tentative recognition that they could be necessary to one another in ways that had nothing to do with the colonel's intention. People on the estate whispered as governors of rumor will do. To some, the frontier post had become a scandal, a mistress reduced, a strong black man in charge of a woman of the house. Whispers paired outrage and appetite as if the two were inseparable. Helena felt the weight of those glances even in her cabin. She turned her back at times to the mirror because she did not want to see what gossip wanted to carve into her face. She had not asked for the separation. She did not choose it. She had chosen, however, in the small and intimate arithmetic of two people's days, to accept small mercies. There were moments of alarm, days when the colonel's anger took the form of letters written sharp and cold, delivered by riders whose faces were like grey flags. One such letter arrived 6 weeks into her exile. It read in stern hand that the household would not tolerate any disgrace, and it suggested further discipline if Helena did not return to decorum. The words were edged with threat. Helena took the letter to Batuk. He read it, and there was no theatrical flair in his reaction. He folded the rag of paper and tucked it into his shirt like a man who keeps a small animal because it will not make a noise if it is held close. "You understand," he said to her, not as command but as acknowledgement. "He will look for what he believes you've done to bring shame." She did understand, in the way that knowing the position of a blade in a room clarifies how to move. She also understood something else. Her body had altered in the last weeks. Small changes at first, a nausea that came intermittently, an appetite that slid into craving, a tiredness that made dawn feel like a journey. She told herself it was the work. She told herself it was the weather. The truth is that sometimes the body will hold a verdict the mind has not yet delivered. The realization that she might be pregnant came like a rumor in her own household, soft then solid. It was a quiet terror, a new ledger she had not expected to balance. She and Batouk sat in the lamplight and planned with a clarity sharpened by fear and affection. To leave, to flee, to travel south to a town where anonymity might be purchased with coin and where the child might be allowed to breathe without the constant threat of a name to be erased. They mapped the roads he knew, traced trails through patches of forest where the undergrowth could hide them, and counted the days until they believed they could move. The plan grew in small steps. Her jewels secreted into a parcel, a horse readied, a time chosen for a night when the moon would be less than a witness. They spoke in the hush of a shared conspiracy, lowering their voices as if to keep news from being blown into the world by careless winds. When they touched, it was a touch born of urgency as much as of tenderness, fingers that needed to know how to tie a knot, the press of a palm against a wound. She had come to rely on Batouk's steadiness. He moved like a man who made decisions as though hedging against loss. There was a new note to their days, a contained urgency. Work continued in the mornings, but at night plans were made with a clarity that seemed to make the air itself sharper. Sometimes they would stand at the edge of the compound and peer down the road, watching for any sign of riding lights. There were nights when Helena could not sleep, and she would listen to his breathing, finding in it the map of the man who was no longer merely custodian, but the axis of a life she had not intended to inhabit. Rumors of plans have ways of leaking through even the tightest seams. Word traveled slowly from the house, couriers who had known the estate for years, eyes sharper than maps. A rider with a stiff face arrived earlier than they had expected, and the tension that had been an undercurrent flooded to the surface like a sudden tide. The colonel's men had begun to sniff at the air. Their presence meant peril. A line of men on horseback could close the routes they had planned to take. On the morning slated for departure, the sky was low and full of a kind of green-grey expectation. The horses were saddled before dawn. Helena's hands trembled as she hid the small parcel of jewels under the panniers. Batouk watched and offered no reassurances that were mere words. Instead, he burned the edge of a rope to make it hold. The few villagers who had known of the plan offered small prayers or averted their gazes. Some loaded provisions into the back of a wagon without making a spectacle. There was a measured economy to everyone's movements, as if motion might keep fate docile. They rode away with the edges of the world closing behind them. For a while the road was mercy. Trees arched, wind took the heat off their faces, and Helena felt a small, irrational joy at the thought of moving toward an unknown that was not immediately set by the colonel's orders. She clung to Batouk's hand as they passed a stand of younger trees and felt his fingers close around hers, strong, sure, a tether. It was a touch that carried promise and fear in equal measure. But the land keeps its records. Footprints have the fidelity of witnesses. The Kapangas, once alerted, do not need to be fast. They need to be tireless. Men with horses know how to follow trails like scripture. It was not long, the men said, before the sound of a distant riding became a drum in the woods. Batouk spurred his horse with the economy of a man who had prepared for this eventuality and had not wasted time pretending surprise. The chase began with ordinary urgency, and then hardened into something more brutal. They moved through a landscape that shifted from pastoral softness to the more dangerous grammar of inland routes. The forest closed around them, branches catching at cloaks and hair. At one point a rustle spiked into panic as a wild cat, an onser displaced by the disturbance, crossed their path and vanished as if it had been only a phantom. The horses skidded. A moment's chaos and then control returned. They crossed a river by a ford Batouk knew well. He slowed the horse in the waist-deep current, and the water licked at their saddles. Helena clung to him, not out of propriety now, but necessity. No lesson could have taught her the balance of a horse in the water. He hummed a small low sound under his breath, the kind of sound that steadies both rider and mount. In that hour she saw him for what he was, a man who had been shaped by the world's cruelty and had chosen a form of courage that was almost domestic in its economy. He thought of the plan and its risks. He thought too of the child she carried, a life he now carried the responsibility for. He had never asked for heroics because his life had taught him there were few proper answers for the violence of men, only choices made in bad weather. The pursuers tightened their net. Men on horseback began to cut across clearings and to lift branches to spy through the undergrowth. The Kapangas who rode for the colonel were not merely servants of a single temper, they were instruments of a system that required obedience to be taught by fear. Their shouts could be heard as they threaded horses through brush. The chase was no longer easy. They aimed not for glory, but for the punishment the colonel had ordained, and it would be administered with a kind of care that made it final. It was during this tightening that the sky darkened with a threat not of guns but of storm. The first thunder came as a warning. The next roll was nearer and full of the promise of rain. Around them the world shifted. Air thickened, birds fell sudden into silence. The leaves of the trees turned their undersides outward as if to confess secrets, and the ground began to smell like old stone. They were running into more than men. The weather itself was a force like any pursuer. Batuk looked up at the clouds and swore a single word that was the sum of many decisions. Helena felt it then, the truth that there might be no straight line between escape and the safety they had imagined. The sound of the riders behind them became a part of the weather, distant, increasing, inexorable. Something in the air suggested that the moment of choice was arriving. They could press on and risk getting cut off on a narrow trail swollen by rain. They could attempt to lose themselves in the thickness of brush that would slow both horse and pursuer, but also make movement perilous. Batuk weighed these choices with a speed that was all muscle memory. He could see the riders' positions by the sound and by the way the leaves moved where they had passed. He thought of Helena's hands on the reins, her breath shallow with fear. He thought, too, of the child. There was a calculus that no gambler would have respected, one that cared only for the life at its center. At the edge of a small hollow, where the land dented and the road pinched, Batuk reined up. For a blink that felt like the length of a lifetime, he turned in the saddle and looked straight at Helena. His face was not made for grand speeches. It was honest work turned human. He did not soften the truth. "You must go," he said. "You must take what you can and leave. I will slow them. There is no other way." Helena, white-lipped, looked at him as if she might refuse. In the shape of a life that had been punctured by orders, refusing was a way to retain some memory of the girl who once answered a count with a blade of wit. But this moment demanded a price. She thought of the child curled, perhaps sleeping under the arc of her breast, and the price shifted into terrible clarity. "Not without you," she said, the words like a small rebellion and a small prayer at once. Batuke reached into his shirt and took from it the small wooden bead he had carved for her weeks before, the one he had dropped in her palm with no ceremony. He pressed it into her hand. "Take this," he said. "If you must tell his name, tell him this: Miguel. Tell him he came from love that did what it could. Run." She had argued with him with every rhetorical instrument left to her, promise, anger, shame, but he would not be convinced to run as one man on another's back. He had chosen, in a life that had given him only compromises, to give this final act of agency to the person he loved. The sound of horses drew nearer like a swell of a sea. He gave her a look that held not bravado, but a certain quiet acceptance of what he would be called to do. She flung her horse into a run while he stayed, cutting into the undergrowth as if it were a protective spell. She did not look back until the trees took him from sight. She would not know what exactly transpired in the next moments. She would remember only the way the thunder tore the world, and a sharp, guttural shout that suggested battle. She would remember the sudden, paralyzing fear when a distant shot cracked like a sharp insect, and then two, and then a pause that felt like a mouth had closed around the world. She would remember later that the road she rode felt wider and lonelier. as if the space a person left behind could be felt in the grain of the earth. When she reached a narrow town 3 hours south, her knees weak and breath unsteady, she dismounted and did not immediately ask for help. There was a moment where all the things that had been happening to her, the punishment, the work, the small mercies, the plan, the flight, crystallized into one unbearable fact. She had been taken from a house by a man's hand and had entrusted herself to a man who was now not with her. In that ache rose also a fierce gratitude for the life he had given her by choice, and an even fiercer grief at the cost. She wrapped the wooden bead in a scrap of cloth and hid it under the lining of her bodice. She would not, even in this moment, let the item be the cause of certainty. The bead would remain a private talisman, a small memory of hands that had carved an answer. In the morning she would search for a room to rest and a place to birth the child if necessary, and she would think of the little circuit of the world she had left behind and of the man who had chosen to make himself a sacrifice. The sky kept its promise of rain. In the town people stared at the woman who arrived with mud on her hem and a look like someone who had seen a border crossed inside the chest. She was both pitied and envied. For some, the thought of her having thrown away silk for the uncertainty of escape was the final folly of a spoiled woman. For others, she was a symbol of something dangerous, a woman who would not be controlled. They would not know the truth of what she carried in her chest as she sat by a window and watched the rain erase the tracks she left behind. The world outside drooped under the weather. Inside, she tried to stitch together plans that had been shattered but not obliterated. She had left with a name to remember and a bead to slip into darkness. The rest would have to be made in the days to come, days that would include births and deaths not yet written, the taste of coffee made by someone who had never before been called mother, and the slow, steady work of teaching a child to speak the truth. For now the rain on the window sounded like a drum that marked the hours she had survived. The life she would live would be built on a foundation of stolen nights, careful lies, and the memory of a man who had taken his place between her and the world. If it was supposed to be a punishment, its consequence had been a strange and costly tenderness. The measure of what had been done would not be found in neat verdicts. It would live in names, in a bead of wood hidden against a breast, in the memory that would feed a son and set his feet upon roads that would one day be trodden by those who would demand different laws. The punishment was a beginning, not an end, an ugly incision that opened into a life neither of them had chosen, but which both tried to make into something like redemption. The cost of that making had not yet been paid. The reckoning waited, patient as thunder. The town waited the rain out with a patience that had nothing to do with hope. Helena sat by a window and watched the tracks blur in the gutters, the marks she had made erased, as if the land wanted to deny it had been crossed at all. Inside, the room smelled of boiled herbs, and whatever linen the widow who took her in had saved for emergency trade. The bead, wooden, browned by hands and time, lay against her breast like a private pulse. She kept it there as one keeps a secret vow. When the labor began, it was not cinematic. There were no convocations of angels, no sudden clarity. There was a rawness that took hold of the body and did not ask permission. The midwife was a blunt woman, with the economy of someone who had seen the human shape break and knit more times than she could count. She moved with sure hands and a voice that refused sentimentality. "Breathe," she said. "Listen to the sound, and do not listen to the fear." Helena did as she was told, because she had learned by then that some instructions were the only currency that mattered. The child came with a cry that was more astonishment than sound. It was as if the world itself offered a grudging recognition. Helena did not catch his weight or measure. There was little of the polish that had once accompanied birth in her father's house, but she understood with the peculiar and immediate love that first finds a mother by force that this small being would be the pivot of the rest of her life. They wrapped him in a cloth of blue the widow gave, and Helena pressed the bead into the infant's hand until the tiny fingers closed around it. Miguel, she thought, and the name felt like a small prophecy. Her first weeks as a mother were a montage of need and improvisation. She slept poorly and ate what others could spare. She learned which herbs calmed a fever and which suggested worry. The townspeople, kind in a practical, limited way, did what townspeople do. They observed and then gave what was expected of their observation. A loaf, a patch sewn, a look. There were days when she tempted pity, and days when she tasted contempt, and Helena learned to take both as matters of weather. The thought of Batuk returned in the empty hours between nursing and mending. She did not know the particulars of his death. The rumor she had heard in the first days after her flight was a rumor shaped by men who loved tidy narratives. They said he had fought, that he had bought them time. It was a truth and an incompleteness, that peculiar fact of history where consequence is real, but the shape of an ending is never entirely clear. Miguel grew sturdy and watchful. He held the bead as if it were a relic rather than a toy. As he learned to speak, first words clustered around food, around small joys, and then he learned to say Batuk from a story she told him when he was old enough to ask why his fingers liked to curl round a wooden bead. Helena limited herself in particulars, both to protect what pride she had and to keep grief contained. He kept us safe, she would say. Miguel sat with the simple conviction of a child who believes the people he loves are made of virtues rather than contradictions. The years that followed were small victories against a steady friction. Helena found work as a seamstress for a boarding house frequented by sailors and merchants, people who needed repairs more than they needed conversation. She mended collars, patched trousers, and learned to count coins with a care that made even small payments feel like triumphs. She taught Miguel as he grew, first the letters pressed into his imagination by charcoal on scraps, then the patient lessons of arithmetic held in the margins of old newspapers. He was a quick study. His mind liked the order of facts, the way a bird likes the layout of a nest. Yet the world outside their small life did not always reward neatness. Miguel bore the marks of his mixed descent in a society that gave categories sharpness. Sometimes doors opened for him because of the glow of a mother's story or the whim of a patron. Sometimes those same doors closed with a cruelty that made the small child's jaw set. An old man who had once been a trapper, Zayda Onsa, so named for the ferocious clarity of a time when he once saved 2 men from a jaguar, kept watch over their immediate fortunes with an odd grandfatherly affection. He had seen much of the violence that structured the coast and had retained a certain lugubrious sense of moral accounting. He offered Helena work and small pieces of advice that sometimes felt like commandments. "Teach the boy his letters," he said one day, resting a hand on Miguel's shoulder. "Teach him the names of things. Power lives in knowing." That phrase, "power lives in knowing," became a kind of mantra in the house where they had little else to call canon. A handful of people in town, free black artisans, an ex-slave turned cooper, a woman who ran a small school out of a back room, took to Miguel like to a promising plant. They encouraged him to read aloud, to listen to stories of the world beyond the hills, to develop an appetite for law courts and the words marshaled within them. By the time he was old enough to leave for the provincial capital, his mind had been trained to notice how rules were written and who they were written to bend. Helena watched him go with a complexity of feeling that mixed pride with a trembling she could not name. She had wanted for him both the safety denied to others like him and the dignity for which some men had to fight vocations their kin had never imagined. She wrote him letters in a neat hand, folding money into the edges when she could spare it. She kept the bead where he could see it when he slept, and told him of Batuka in the way that turns memory into a guide rather than a lament. "He did not want your life to be small," she told Miguel once on a porch night. "He wanted you to be the kind of man who understands that choice is the first kind of freedom." Miguel repeated the kernel in his mouth like prayer and made it a map. The capital was harsher and kinder in different measures. A city teaches a young mind that the world is both larger than he thought and crueler in methods. Miguel found patrons who were moved by the story Helena sent with him, a priest, a man of letters, an abolitionist with an appetite for reasoned argument. These figures opened doors. He studied law with the intensity of someone who saw legal practice as a way to rebalance what had been broken. His mind delighted in parsing statutes, in finding the seams of language where equity might be inserted. Yet the practice of law in that Brazil was messy. There were regimes of prejudice written into forms and habits. The law was sometimes a shield and other times a bludgeon. He found cause to fight early. Cases came to him from the docks. Men denied wages, freed people whose births had not been registered, families evicted from plots. Miguel learned courtrooms the way a sailor learns tides, where the law might lift you and where it would pull you under. His oratory was careful rather than flamboyant. He preferred a clean fact to a flourish. He bore his mother's stories like a lined map, every fold a route he had to avoid. When he won a case where a freed woman's right to her child was recognized, he did not stand on the steps of the court with triumph. He walked home and calmed his mother's fatigue with a small plain meal. As Miguel gained stature, so too did the world around Helena shift. The arc of history that moves in vague but unstoppable ways, economic pressures, international scrutiny, activism in the press, began to impinge on the private lives of families like the Menezes. Voices in the city called for a rethinking of the foundations of labor and personhood. The abolitionist movement, which earlier had been a chorus of marginal actors, grew into a pressing public force. Miguel lent his voice modestly and persistently to petitions and assemblies. He wrote pamphlets in his spare hours and spoke at gatherings where the crowd was mixed, black and white, poor and relatively prosperous, angry and tired. He never forgot the bead in his pocket, the smell of the cabin, the lamplight that had sometimes been his first alley of understanding about what a father might be willing to risk. News, always a treacherous thing, had its way of arriving late and inaccurate. Only years after Batuque's sacrifice did an old itinerant worker who had once served in the frontier post come to the town where Helena lived. He shivered as if cold though the season was warm, and he sat on a stoop and told a story in which the facts were the kind that only partials could be, that he had seen a man hold a line of riders for a span long enough to be counted, that he had seen the man fall and that a grave was dug where rain could fold into it. He spoke of a name carved in haste into a piece of wood near the grave. Someone had left a bead on the small mound before riding on, and the anecdote settled into Helena's mind like a pebble in a shoe. She walked to the end of the town one afternoon and held her hand to the sky, wishing she could find a way to walk back into the forest where the road had swallowed him. She never went. Some sacrifices, she would later say, are a map to a country you cannot visit again. Miguel, once he understood the details, felt grief that was both personal and political. He read the law with a new zeal born of a private ledger. A man's life had been taken to buy his. He carried Batuque's image in mind, not as a heroic figure, but as a man with a litany of small strengths. The bead, worn and darkened, became a public talisman at private moments. On nights when Helena's breathing faltered, he would lay the bead over her palm and feel the steady smallness of something that had outlasted storms. As the years crested toward abolition, the Menezes family, those who remained, were not immune to the slow erosion of practice. They were a family of measure and ritual. Their status rested upon laws and habits that had been built to support a particular order. Miguel's rising presence in legal circles began to wear on those habits like wind on an old roof. A nephew of Colonel Menezes, prosperous and doctrinal, attempted in official letters to circle the older man's name with the claim of wrongs. Miguel answered in the language he knew: petitions, charges, public denouncements of practices that had been normalized in the countryside. He did not seek revenge. Helena had taught him that revenge was a poor currency for long fights. He sought redress and recognition. He sought in the narrow things he could do to make sure others might be spared the sharpness that had cut his mother. Political tides change slowly enough to be invisible, and then suddenly with a speed that feels alarming. The abolitionist cause found its success as the empire reeled and political calculus shifted. When the law that abolished slavery was finally decreed in 1888, it arrived as both vindication and an inadequate ending. For people like Helena and Miguel, the new law did not erase the marks left on bodies and hearts. It did, however, provide a language with which to insist upon the existence and citizenship of those who had been denied it. Miguel turned his legal skills toward the practicalities of this new era. He labored to register births, to claim pensions where they existed, and to demand that the machinery of the state acknowledge the full humanity of those it had once reduced to property. Helena watched these changes with a complex satisfaction. She lived long enough to see the boy she had birthed argue matters of law with men half his age who had once considered themselves custodians of custom. She saw him win small victories for women who had been denied children by law and for men who sought their wages. She saw, even amid setbacks, the steady accrual of justice. But the years had their costs. Helena's hands, once nimble and capable, trembled with a slightness that was more sorrow than age. Her hair silvered and then thinned. The sewing light grew a little harder for her tired eyes. Still, there was dignity. She kept the bead in a place of honor on a small string around her neck, beneath the shirt, so its weight was private. It was her link to the man who had chosen an impossible act. In the evenings, she told Miguel stories not to inflame fury, but to locate memory. She insisted that the telling was not to lionize the past, but to teach a new generation how to hold what had happened. "Do not make him a statue," she said once, stirring broth with a wooden spoon. "Remember him as a man who loved. Remember what that love cost. We must not make saints out of the dead in order to let the living forget." Miguel took the admonition seriously. It shaped his speeches and his petitions. He refrained from mythologizing, preferring to anchor argument in human consequence. When the time of Helena's death came, it was not dramatic. It was an evening light folding like a page. Miguel sat with her, fingers laced to hers, the bead warm enough from their shared skin to feel like a quiet heat. She did not speak at length. She placed the bead in his palm and looked at him in a way that asked him to keep what was essential. "Tell him," she said, her voice thinner but steady. "Tell him his name was Miguel because he should know there was always a name to claim. Tell him we were loved in the way that makes people risk things." He answered with a promise that was both a vow and a legal pledge. He would not let the story be buried. Her death in 1890 was a small city event for those who had watched the arc of her life. Some remembered the girl from the ball, carved in glitter and silk. Others remembered the woman in a plain apron who argued for the rights of children like she once had. A modest procession took her to a plot in a public cemetery. No marble, no columned monument, only a stone with few words. The epitaph read as she had wished: Helena de Menezes, 1825 to 1890. Loved courageously, lived with dignity, died free. It was not a grand phrase. It did not attempt to heal the wrongs that had been done. It was instead a testament to existence under duress. Miguel carried the bead thereafter as both heirloom and instrument. He became known in professional circles for his steady intelligence and an uncommon insistence that laws be read with an eye to fairness. He lectured and wrote. He took cases that others would not, small claims that might not pay, and battles over registration and identity that required more patience than spectacle. He became a man who knew how to wear legal language as a hinge for social change. He did not pursue the family of Colonel Menezes ferociously. Legal life wore a slow and complicated face, but he did pursue recognition, records, and reparations in the manner of steady work. There were moments when history jarred against memory with awkward force. At one point, a descendant of the colonel proposed a public petition to clear the family's name, shaping themselves as victims of false rumor. Miguel answered with documents, with sworn testimonies, with the meticulous work of a man who trusted that accumulation of facts could expose more than rhetoric ever could. The public imagined dramas and duels and theatrical reckonings. The real work was less glamorous. It was archives, cemetery registries, the testimony of old hands who remembered cattle movements and seekers' paths. In the end, the truth did not come as a thunderclap, but as small corroborations that together made a picture. Memory proved nevertheless a treacherous partner. Batuque never became a household name in the broad sense. He lived largely in the margins, the small carved bead carried in secret, the whispered name at the edge of a meeting, the single wooden stake over a grave. Yet in the lives he touched, the consequences were deep. Miguel's legal battles opened doors for others to register births and to claim rights. The bead, worn now on a worn cord, was slipped into the hands of a child who would carry it to a public office, and in a small way show a document to a clerk that demanded acknowledgement. In the third decade after Helena's exile, when the country was reshaping itself and legal categories were being negotiated amid new economic pressures, Miguel stood before a small assembly and spoke about a life his mother had lived. He did not attempt to flourish. He began with the bead. He told the story not as outrage alone, but as integumental truth, how love can be born in impossible places, and how sacrifice can, with remarkable generosity, choose the safety of another. He ended by asking the room to consider what it means to remember those who had been made invisible. "We do not make them saints," he said, "for sanctifying erases the human. We remember them as people who chose." Those words entered public papers and then private notebooks. They did not fix history, but they nudged it. There were those who misunderstood him. There were always people who wanted an easy story, that the punishment had been a trial that ended in love and therefore justified the original violence. Miguel never allowed that framing. In his speeches, he made clear that the state's use of punishment to teach humility had been an exercise of power that left destruction. He argued that the affection that followed could not be used as a cloak to excuse the initial harm. He insisted on the ambivalence of love born under duress. It was real, but it did not cleanse the sin that created it. His legal writings were peppered with this moral insistence, to remember without smothering, to honor without excusing. The bead continued to travel, first around Miguel's neck, then down his shirt into a small tin when he went away on cases. Once, when Miguel was a man in his 30s, he returned to the frontier post not to revisit old battles, but to find the truth of a grave. He hired a guide and walked the damp path, the trail barely a whisper underfoot. He found a mound in a forgotten clearing, a stake half rotten, and at its foot a small carved notch where perhaps someone had once held a bead. He knelt, and memory rose like a tide. In the dirt he dug with a careful hand, and though he found no body, he found evidence of a kind of burial, bits of wood, a trace of fabric, the suggestion that someone had tended a grave in haste. It was not cinematic, it was practical and profoundly brittle. He left a bead of his own there, not to mark victory, but to keep company. Years later, when the country had shifted but not altogether transformed, Miguel reflected on what his mother had taught him, that memory must be kept with the humility that preserves truth and the courage that does not allow forgetting. He married a woman from the city who knew how to keep accounts and how to name discomfort. They had children, and he told them of their grandmother and of the man who had given them a chance. The bead passed within the family as a sign that some stories must be carried, naming what was owed rather than asking for absolution. The final scene of the life Helena had been given to live repeats a motif she had always carried: the lamplight. On a small evening, a granddaughter came to sit by the old table and asked about the bead. Miguel's hand found it in a drawer, still smoothed by the sweat and skin of generations. He told her the story as he had been told, not a romance of absolution, but a biography of choices. "He was not perfect," Miguel said, "and neither are we. He chose a way in an impossible hour." The child listened with the curiosity that is the seed of justice. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first and then more determined, and the old house glowed a little under the wet sky. There are some things that history cannot reconcile. The punishing hand that sent a young woman away remains a symbol not of discipline, but of domination. The act that followed, Batouk's decision to delay the pursuers, cannot be used to justify the initial cruelty. Between those two acts lies the long work of moral discernment. Love can bloom in soil made by violence. It can also be a way out, a way of claiming a future that was denied. The story of Helena and Batouk resists easy summation because it sits at the intersection of pain and tenderness, of coercion and choice. It insists that we hold contradictory truths together, that the punishment was unjust, and that a relationship born from its aftermath could be real, tender and reciprocal, without ever erasing the violence that preceded it. When people asked later whether Helena had loved the service too much, as the scandalous rumor in a million whispered menus once put it, Miguel's answer was clinical and full of sorrow. "Love is not a verdict on punishment," he would say. "It is a testimony to what humans can do even when systems around them are rotten, but testimony is not a pardon." He insisted on complexity. He insisted on naming the costs. The wooden bead remained the smallest of their archives, a private object whose quietness carried history the way a small bell carries a chord. It was not evidence of absolution, but an emblem of persistence, of hands that had carved and given, of a mother who had named a child to insist on his right to a life. and of a son who used the law not to exact vengeance, but to open doors that had hitherto been sealed. The cemetery where Helena's stone rests is modest. Visitors come sometimes, those who once sat in Miguel's lectures, those who had been helped by his petitions, the children of families who had been touched by the small acts of registration that made legal persons into citizens. They lay small plain flowers and sometimes a scrap of cloth from distant fields. They do not come to wipe away guilt, so much as to witness that one life, complicated and constrained, had unfolded into choices that mattered. In the end, the story leaves questions rather than posters. It asks whether a punitive order can ever be redeemed by private tenderness, whether memory ought to freeze a man into martyrdom or to serve as a caution, whether the price of freedom is simply paid by a single sacrifice. It is a story of people who became necessary to one another in a world that forced them into an intimacy they did not choose, and then made them choose again and again what kind of people they would be. For those who ask whether she ever forgave the hand that sent her away, the answer is evasive and human. Helena learned to live with the memory, to pick the small mercies out of the mud, and to teach a son to be better in the ways that mattered. She did not forgive the system, she did not forget the shame, but she made from her life a sustained refusal to be defined only by what had been done to her. She embraced a frail and fierce brand of dignity and passed it on. If the title tempted the world to reduce it to a scandalous line, it was just a punishment. But Sinhá loved the service too much. The truth is messier and truer. It was a punishment, one that deserves condemnation. What followed was a human story that refused neat labels. There was love, complicated, real, and shadowed with the memory of violence, and there was sacrifice that carried the weight of a small liberation. The history does not let us rest in easy judgments. It compels us to ask, in the long ledger of wrongs, how do we honor those who made costly choices without making their suffering into spectacle? How do we remember the man who died at the side of a road for the life of another without turning him into a tool for self-justification? When you leave this story, perhaps take one small thing with you: the bead. Not as a token of absolution, but as a reminder that lives are entangled with systems larger than we are, and that courage sometimes comes clothed in a most ordinary quietness. Remember to ask not whether the love that followed justified the punishment, because it does not, but whether we, as a society, will refuse to allow such punishments to be given in the first place. If this story moved you, share it with someone who will sit with its discomfort and its tenderness. Tell us, would you have left everything for love?